it's high time that we stop telling women they need to be fixed. This work isn't about fixing ourselves. And I think this first step, right, of being really rooted in celebration and desire changes that narrative slowly over time. Like when you find yourself thinking like I did, I'm terrible at this job. This was my dream job, right? And I'm like, I'm terrible at this. I need to go do something completely different. I think that's when you can really step into this tool.
Hi, and welcome back to the Integrative Women's Health Podcast. I'm Dr. Jessica Drummond, founder and CEO of the Integrative Women's Health Institute, and your host for today's episode. I am here with Sara Sohn, and we are going to have I hope, fascinating and wide-ranging conversation about burnout, especially for women's and pelvic health professionals, for health and wellness professionals who are feeling overwhelmed and burned out by the challenging work that we do every day. So welcome, Sara. Thanks so much for being here with us today.
Thank you. I'm so excited about this topic. And currently where I am, like physically and time-wise in my life, this is the perfect time to have this conversation. So I'd love to even just start there and give you some context of where I'm sitting and where I am, but I'm thrilled to be here. Yeah. This is such a good conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's start there. And I'd also love to hear what made you interested in becoming an expert in burnout. What's your personal story around that?
So I don't know if I'm an expert in burnout, but I would say I'm pretty good at living a good work-life balance. But so I'm currently at the moment actually sitting on my mom's couch, and my mom, I'm visiting my family, is an OBGYN. My mom had her own practice. So growing up, I saw that she had multiple locations, and actually they all went out of business, and she was incredibly burnt out. I was very fearful to go to medical school. I was very fearful of anything to do with medicine because I saw what medicine did to my own mother and to people. And then going to physical therapy school, being so interested, just like you, in helping people with their most intimate, private concerns, that part, the emotional part, the like labor of really holding people in their most tender places in their life isn't talked about. And I felt so beyond burnt out. I worked, now I have my own practice, but working for someone else, being in charge of the physical therapy, assistant schedules and my own, and having like 20 minutes per person. And I honestly thought that I was just terrible at my job. I was like, oh, wow, I picked the wrong profession. I am terrible at this. Like, how am I supposed to have a like 20 minutes go by and I've only really gotten to know them, just like, oh, you have 3 children. Tell me more, like,
yeah.
So I just thought,
yes.
I thought, wow, Sara, you're quirky. You have too much ADHD. This is not the job for you. This career, you're going to like, literally, I was like, I'm going to have to become a sign language interpreter. So, true story. So there was one day I really recognized I was burnt out. I was like, and this is like a little shameful for me. So just hold space and tenderness for that. But I was seeing a patient, and I remember she started to get really emotional. She was crying and telling me something about her pelvic pain. Mm-hmm. And my first thought wasn't empathy. It wasn't, how can I console this person? My first thought, which terrified me, was, well, expletive, I'm not going to get to eat lunch today. Mm-hmm. And
yeah,
that scared me. That is not me. I did not go into this career for that to be my thought when someone shares something so sensitive about their pelvic pain. Like, and so I didn't realize it at the time, but hindsight has so many lessons. At the time, I was like, I need to go on an adventure, and I'm not exaggerating. I booked a trip from Panama, a solo trip from Panama to Antarctica right before the pandemic. I didn't quit my job, but I said, I'm going to Antarctica.
Right. So, you're like, I'll be right back.
Yeah. And funny story, I actually got stuck in Antarctica because of COVID. So that's a whole separate thing. But that experience, I'm like, okay, once I came back and I started my own practice, and I really did it in the way that feels good to me, not only do I have the confidence like, wow, I am amazing at this job. I'm not bad at this job. I'm bad at doing 10 things at the same time. That's unrealistic. Not
Hmm.
only do my patients have better outcomes and they're happier because I spend not everyone has this liberty, but I spend a lot of time with each of my clients.
Hmm.
But I also have confidence in my pricing. So burnout isn't just about like, go take a bath. It's about having a structure that supports you from being able to live how you want to live. Like it supports my pricing. I feel very confident in my pricing, which is higher than most people would feel comfortable to say out loud. I feel very confident in I literally, the reason I'm at my mom's house, Jessica, is because I just went away for I don't do this all the time, but I just went backpacking in New Zealand for 2 months. Like I feel confident to
Nice.
take time off if that's my
Hmm.
dreams. I
Hmm.
feel confident in it's really changed even how I view burnout and view that for my own patients. It's changed my
Hmm.
whole lens to how can we create within the structure of their life that they have to do. You have to get food on the table for your kids.
Hmm.
How can we, it's not bubble baths. Like
Right.
what are the actual things that we can do that can where they can see change and not just feel bad all the time, like they're not doing enough, they're bad at their job, they're bad as a mom, they're, especially with women.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, before we go on, I really appreciate you sharing that story because I think for all of us, our listeners right now who are in clinical or coaching jobs that are being basically driven by other people's productivity standards, by hospital based productivity standards, we forget that the system evolved roughly 20 years ago, maybe slightly longer now. I forget that the 20 years ago wasn't the 80s, right? So probably 30 years ago. But 20, 25 years ago, healthcare shifted from being driven by clinicians to being driven by finance, essentially people who had trained in business and finance, who don't have that clinical lens for what that personal work really is. And the fact that I think everyone has had that moment where they're sitting in front of a client and saying, gosh, I'm not going to get to have lunch right now. And as a clinician, I remember a similar thought. I was pregnant, probably with my second daughter at this point, and I remember sitting in front of a client who was also pregnant and coming to me for back pain, and I was like, "Wow, I'm pretty sure my back hurts worse than hers."
Oh
And so,
yeah.
when you're in this moment where you're like, "Ugh," do I have the energy to take care of this person, not to mention the time and the cognitive attention. So everyone has felt that moment. Well, I wouldn't say everyone has felt that, but if you have felt that moment, that's very, very common and is a little yellow flag that you might be on the path to burnout because, as you said, we need to create a structure that allows us to have autonomy over our time, our energy that may or may not align with certain jobs. And so, how long were you in practice before you felt that?
Is it okay if I actually just speak to what you just said about validation? Because I really agree
Hmm.
with you.
Hmm.
I think one of the first signs of burnout that isn't talked about enough is that looking for validation for our pain, especially if we're starting to do it with our loved ones and our clients. So it's
Mm.
like, but my back hurts even more. And you're wanting to be valid because there's grief here. Like it's easy for me, right? I'm 32 years old. I recognize I'm a lot younger than a lot of my peers. And it's easy to be like, well, it's easy for her. She's a XYZ, this 32-year-old, da 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 da. And really being grounded in the privilege that I do have that maybe someone else doesn't, and also grounded in the systemic problems that exist that we can't just fix like overnight,
Quickly.
even if we want
Yeah.
to.
Yeah.
But when you start really looking for that validation of, well, I'm not getting as much sleep as, I had 4 kids and I wasn't tired. So therefore my patient doesn't need to be tired. Like really, that's how you know that that's starting to really eat away at why you maybe started to do this in the first place. And
Yeah.
it's a
And I
normal
think,
brain activity.
yeah, I think when your brain starts to be like, you think this is bad, it's not that either of us said those things out loud, but I think a lot of people have probably experienced that little yellow flag of like a client says something important and vulnerable and, they're sharing your story, but in your mind, you're like, you think that's bad, blah, 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 and I think, as you said, when you're just getting, when that's your kind of like first brain reaction, it's a really important sign to bring awareness to that, like, you're not supported enough to do the challenging work of holding space for someone else who's also being challenged. So I think it's fascinating that we both had that experience. And for me, well, let's see. My second daughter was born when I was 36. So I was probably 35 ish. And I think that by that time, I'd been practicing for maybe 10 years or so, maybe a little bit longer. And so, it doesn't have to be that long into your career. That was like the first third even of my career that you can feel this. You can feel this when it's your first couple years out of school. And I think it's still important to pay attention to but the problem there is, as you were saying, then you're like, oh, shoot, what am I going to do? This is what I've trained for. This is what I've spent all this money for in training. How do I make that transition? So then obviously you went on that vacation, but it's one thing to take a little break, which is important. I think sometimes people just need to take a little break. But it's another thing to when you came back, you actually transformed your work. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I wasn't a new grad. I was only practicing under, I think, 5 years, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And when I came back, and I think it's important to have peers around you when you're first practicing,
Mm-hmm.
but I really wanted to start my own practice. And we were all in this global pandemic. So I thought, well, this is a good time to do this. People are wanting one on one care. So I started going in homes,
Okay.
people are
Mm-hmm.
wanting one on one care in their home. They're not leaving their home, that kind of thing. And now I've grown to having my own practice and I'm a multi interested person. And I used
Mm-hmm.
to think that associative thinking, the way that my brain works, I don't know if you attract other neurodivergent people, but like I used to think that the way that my brain works, to have many interests, to have very associative thinking where I connect many dots, that was a terrible thing, especially terrible as a medical provider. But I've really become confident in who I am and use that to my advantage. So my weeks are very varied, which is something I personally need. So
Mm-hmm.
Wednesdays and Thursdays, I see clients in the clinic in person. Tuesdays and every other Friday, I do, this is, evolved into this, but Tuesdays and every other Friday, I do a mixture of online telehealth and I have a sexual wellness like online program for health providers. And then Mondays are the things that everyone doesn't actually put on their calendar, but they take a lot of time, like this podcast recording or, like
Mm-hmm.
the the random meeting you wanted to have as an entrepreneur, the accountant, all that kind of stuff
Yeah.
the invisible tasks that actually take a lot of labor. And, honestly, that was really scary. When I first started, none of that was how I did it. I just said, oh, you want to see me? When is the best time for you? Thursday at 9 p.m. I can make that work.
Yeah.
But
Well, yeah.
yeah, slowly and
Yeah.
slowly, I made boundaries, and that's part of what I want to talk about today with preventing burnout. I actually kind of really have deeply thought about this, about the
Mm-hmm.
systemic causes and about what we can personally do to be our fiery selves and fight back against it. But
Mm-hmm.
the first step really is that grief, stepping away from that shame and that grief of maybe feeling like it's all your fault. Like if you just exercised more, if you just slept more, if you just woke up a little earlier, 4 a.m., 3 a.m., 2 a.m. after you breastfed your baby and did 18 things for your business, if you just, saw another client, if you just lowered your prices, raised your prices, if you were just brave enough to hire someone, if you just started a podcast, a Facebook group, an email list, like an Instagram, when you have that kind of thinking, you're going to go insane. So the first step is letting that grief go of all of the things that you feel like you should be doing and getting a little bit clear of there is absolutely no shame in my schedule. Like that was
Mhm.
so hard for me to accept. Like I mentioned, my
Mm.
mom had multiple businesses. My mom sees babies and 18 she can speak multiple language. I always felt like I had to be able to do so much. But that productivity, like when we're real about what our gifts are and we're real about letting some of that go, we can really craft that business relationship in a way that works for us. And even if you don't have your own business, the thing I want to teach you, in small ways, you can start to adapt into your own life.
Yeah. And I think you made a few really important points there. One is that in the beginning, if you are starting your own practice, whatever that looks like, if it's multifaceted, if it's health coaching, if it's pelvic rehab, we have to be honest about the fact that in the really early startup phases, there is a lot of just hustle. And I think sometimes after
Yeah.
you've done it and you've gotten to a place where things are much more manageable and boundaried, people are like, don't do what I did and go,
Yeah.
and work 24/7. But the reality is, everyone who's successful does put in a little time. It doesn't have to be a decade. It could be 6 months. It could be a year. It could be 2 years, something like that. It's not a long, long time. But where they do hustle, in some way, they're working at 9 p.m. I remember another colleague of ours was telling me she like would bring her rehab table to kind of like the trailhead, knowing that there were going to be some people coming off a trail run with some like knee issues, and she could just meet them right there. Like,
Yeah.
there's a hustle to it that I think we have to be honest about when people are kind of exploring building their own thing. But then, as you're saying, then you begin to unravel or unwrap or explore the things that are what one of our master coaches, Kathy Grosshart, calls your free space. Like, what is the thing that you not only are good at, but you like to do? Because you don't have to do everything that you're good at if you don't like to
Yeah.
do it.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a good point of remembering what that feels like when you first started. But I think what you get better at really is adaptability of change. So I think what
Mm,
happens at the beginning is like you feel like you have to do all of these things because you're not entirely sure what's working, and it's hard to let go of certain things because then you feel like the time there was wasted. Like, but let's say, and
mm,
I know you obviously love doing this podcast, but let's say you invested all this time in this podcast and it wasn't actually bringing you to a dream of yours, which maybe, like, my dream was to be able to go to New Zealand for 2 months if I wanted to. Maybe yours is to be able to take your whole family to Christmas, something, I don't know, whatever.
right,
And you
right.
realize, you know what, it's not actually bringing me there. It could be so hard to adapt and change, especially as an entrepreneur, without permission from somewhere, a mentor, something that says, you know
Mm,
what, like, you didn't waste time. You can be validated in seeing that you didn't waste time, but that you need to make a change. And I think that's what people get stuck in, is they don't want to feel like they wasted all that time doing their Reels challenge for an entire year, or whatever it is. When in reality, it was really the simple thing, like setting up a table at the park. You know what I
yeah.
mean? Like that was the thing that was actually connecting with people.
Yeah, that's a really important point, especially for people coming, kind of stepping into an entrepreneur journey. But I also think what's fascinating there is the biggest one of those is people's degree. I have several graduates who are physicians who were ready to let that go and become health coaches,
Mm,
and there felt like this like it was so hard to do that. And I think we see the same thing with
yeah.
any, nurse practitioners, physical therapists. There's a lot. And it's not to say you have to completely let go of your degree or your license. Some people decide to do that, but to even just not use it and go in a different direction for a while is a scary thing.
Change is terrifying. And And change alone, especially change that is somewhat subversive, you're doing something the society is telling you to do slightly different, like not overwork, be selfless to the end of your depth, like I was expressing about. I'm in my mom's craft room. I'm so proud of her. Like, like she learned that lesson a much harder way. And luckily, being her daughter, I got to learn it through her. But being able to learn those lessons through someone else, and someone else to give you that permission of like, hey, I've been there, I've made this change. It was really hard. It was so scary. But like now it's working for me. And I think it will for you too, like just like
Yeah. Yeah.
hold you there.
So, if someone is feeling in that space of overwhelm and stuckness, and they're not sure what's next for them, they're not sure what to let go of, they're not sure what to lean into, and they're physically and emotionally just feeling kind of depleted, where would you suggest they begin?
Always here. So I created this acronym and it's not hokey. I really put a lot of contemplation and a lot of thought here. So I'm going to use it
Hmm.
because I think it's clever.
Great. Yeah,
So
great.
instead of burnout, I call it burn.
Hmm.
BURN. And I in the show notes I can send a video about this, but the B stands for brag, and that's because it worked with the word. But what do I actually mean by that? I actually mean how important it is when we want to make a change. The combat to wanting to make a change that doesn't feel like we're making a change from shame, and it doesn't feel like we're making a change from I need to fix myself because I'm not XYZ enough, is having
Hmm.
some form of gratitude. So, what do I mean by that? I'm a swimmer. Are you a
Hmm.
swimmer by chance?
I mean, I can swim, but I'm not like
Okay.
an expert swimmer. Yes.
I am not fast, but I love open water swimming. So I love to
Okay,
swim
sure.
really big distances in cold water, and like I'm not very fast, and that was important because I'm often by myself. I'm the last little minnow that the shark's going to like attack. And I'm even wearing my swim watch. Like I love to swim, right? So
Great.
as we swim, we go like, 1, 2, 3, breathe. And the way that I look at it is you have one stroke is in gratitude and one is in desire. So as soon as you hit the thing that you always wanted to talk to your boss and take every Thursday off. And now you're doing it, you're always going to think of the next thing you want. I actually might want to start my own business. And then you do that thing and you're like, oh, I actually really want to hire someone to do all my social media. And then you do that thing and you never actually pause to celebrate it. Like you're always just being like, I want to do this, now I want to do this, and I want to do this, and I want to do this. And you're never actually feeling proud of yourself. I call it like, that swim. And I heard this from a different person that called it a walk, but a swim of one foot in gratitude and one in desire. Like, the things going to medical school, going to physical therapy school gave me this compassion and gave me this like celebrating this way to think about people and the world. I'm so proud of myself. And yet I am desiring start to do more coaching and not have to work underneath my license all of the time, and be able to see
Mhm.
people internationally, and maybe start my own online program for hormone wellness because that's something I'm so passionate about, and I just love to help people, especially in a group format or whatever the thing is, right?
Mhm.
So it's one foot in desire, one foot in gratitude, this swim, and I call it bragging, and it's stretchy. It's really, especially for women, I think can be very difficult to do this. So maybe I can even ask you to try. So we have burn. So we're going to have 4 things, but maybe you could just celebrate something and maybe something you're desiring for fun.
Yeah, yeah. And it's funny, this reminds me of probably 20 years ago now, or maybe a little bit less. I learned from a wonderful kind of like women's motivator. Her name is Regina Thomas Sauer. She's still alive, where she has this whole idea of bragging, right? Of women stepping into the first thing a man will say when you meet him is his credentials. And,
Mm-hmm.
this is hard for women. So for me, I would say a depth of gratitude that I have started a really successful podcast. We only launched it about 12 weeks ago, and it's top 30 in integrative women's health. And so I'm feeling excited about that. It's been a lot of fun. I love podcasts in general. And then in terms of desire, one of the next steps for us is we're actually going to be, as a family, simplifying our lives a little bit. And we're moving to a different area in a few months to just be a little closer to my other daughter and just prioritize how our family has shifted in the last few years. So it's both.
Whoa, talk about changes. I feel like the audience that's listening can't see my exuberant hand gestures, but they're very excited for I'm very excited for you. Those are, for a lot of people listening, their nervous system probably just went, oh my gosh, you're moving and starting a podcast at the same time. But that's something, by practicing this, like being rooted in desire, being rooted in gratitude, that's how you're able to do it, because you're proud of something that you did. And you're always, no matter what it was, even if this podcast was like, I mean, I'm so glad you're having me and I think I'm pretty awesome. But imagine I was like all the celebrities that you want to have on here, like you'd be like, well, what's next? Am I going to be on TV? Where's Oprah?
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I think what's so interesting is like you can, I've done these kinds of things now since 2006. So that's almost 20 years. And it gets easier. And
Yeah.
so I think when you have that perspective, it really does get easier and it becomes clearer. So you were like, oh, there'll be celebrities, you'll be on TV. Like, awesome. None of that has any appeal to me whatsoever. I mean, some of that is fine. Like if I had people who had a larger platform who had endometriosis that could help expand that would be great, or would talk about perimenopause or something. But I think what's also really fascinating is once you really do this in alignment with you, there's a lot of things that seem cool from a societal standpoint that you actually don't care about. And that's freeing too.
You model this so well, of when you do things not just for yourself, but for other people. That really helps you to, when both are considered, like what's going to make it where I'm living in the place I want to be living and having the work-life balance and supporting people. Like when you think about both of those at the same time, that really helps to make it much more clear of what your actual desire is, and not vanity and all these things that we feel like it should be.
Thanks for that. I think that's a really useful tool, that balance, because there's a lot of talk of like, what's your vision? And we do this in coaching too, but also that celebration of what you've already done, who you can be grateful to helping get you to this place, because nobody ever does it in a vacuum.
Yes. Some of these ideas I do want to mention. Have you read the book Real Self-Care by Pooja Lakshmi?
I haven't, but I'll add it to the
So
list.
So I have a fun book club, and I mostly do this for myself, to read a book that I want to read once a month. And this book is by a psychiatrist that focuses on women's health. And she has a quote. It's high time that we stop telling women they need to be fixed. This work isn't about fixing ourselves. And I think this first step, right, of being really rooted in celebration and desire changes that narrative slowly over time. Like when you find yourself thinking like I did, I'm terrible at this job. This was my dream job, right? And I'm like, I'm terrible at this. This is, I need to go do something completely different. I think that's when you can really step into this tool.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you for that. So what is step 2?
Okay, so we have burn. This is fun. So B was brag. U is your unique desire. So really thinking about, and it goes right into that, just like we were saying, when you're grounded in those things and what it is, not just for you, but also for other people, it helps you to be very clear about what your unique desires are. And I think it can help to put them as micro doses on your calendar. So I'm not saying like, okay, let's say you have a desire truly to read more books. This is a great example. I think having a microdose for yourself to read a page a day, or do it, I need parallel things, like, so I have to start a book club or something, right? Like putting it in your calendar as this microdose of what you're going to do on a daily basis, and then even something on a monthly basis on your calendar that's a microdose. For me, I do a microdose for myself and a microdose for us, as in me and my partner. but
Hmm.
that might look different for you. But really being unique about what those things are, because it's not about bubble baths. It's a verb. You're always putting in these boundaries for something that's important to you, that reminds you of what's important to you. And even in a microdosed way, like I drink my coffee in this cup outside,
Mm.
or
Mm.
my low acid whatever. I know we're a bunch of pelvic health providers in here, and health coaches and whatever. Nobody be
Right.
food shaming me right now, my hormones, but like your
Yeah.
herbal tea blend with lemon and ginger outside, whatever.
Yes, yes. Well, and sure, coffee has lots of antioxidants, so sometimes it's good for people. Excellent. All right. So step one is that balance between gratitude and desires. Step two is that your desires are unique to you, and I think
Yeah.
that's a really interesting exploration rather than that free space that Kathy, our master coach, is always talking about. Like your desires are different from someone else's, and that dream job that you thought you had evolved into a different dream job, and you could step into that too. There's more possibility out there. Okay, then people have had given them a little space, so they're in the burnout phase right now, but they're going to take 2 hours on a weekend and just be like, what do I even want? They're going to just play with the U step. What's the R step?
Honestly, I don't even want it to be 2 hours. I literally mean a microdose, like the
Okay.
smallest change possible that towards something that you're wanting,
But
that
what if
makes
they
you
don't know what it is yet? Like they need a little time to know what it is, right?
yeah. So if you don't know what it is yet, then get grounded in your senses. So think like literally, I do this with my clients because a lot of my clients, whether they be the entrepreneurs or people with pelvic pain, I have them really learn about the senses that they like the smells, the sights, the taste, and put the smells, the sights, the taste into something you're already doing. Like
Mm-hmm.
I shower, and when I shower, it is a Jessica shower. I put on this playlist that is it is like the Drummond playlist. I put on the this smell because I just love this smell. Really kind of grounding in your senses, and you do that every day of being reminded who the expletive you are. It'll help you to get more and more confident in like, oh, this is who I am. What's next for me? And
Yeah.
sometimes it's as simple as that, like a microdose. But from there, the R that I put is rest sandwich. So I always say that rest has to be sandwiched with the compassion for the guilt that comes up when you have boundaries around rest. So the
Mm.
rest has to be sandwiched with compassion and boundaries. Because when you say, I want to take a nap, there's a lot of messaging that nap, even as simple as a nap, is somewhat bad. That you should be listening to something or writing something. Rest is for a lot of people, very challenging, especially high achieving people that are probably listening to this podcast.
Mhm.
So, so really, it's creating that rest sandwich where you have compassion and boundaries. So, what are my boundaries around this period of rest? And then what compassion do I need either for myself or from another person? Like sometimes compassion, Gabor Mate says that the compassion has to be gifted. It's really
Mm.
hearing that from a partner, from someone you love. Like my partner, he's an amazing sleeper. There could be 18 war zones outside and he would just take a nap. Like one time we were in this tent with bugs that were the size of my hand and this man took a nap. I'm like, "What are you doing?" He'll have a he'll have a
Yeah.
hard day and he'll and I'm like, "Oh, we need to do this, we need to do this, we need to make this ready." And he's just, "Okay, I'll do that in like 2 hours after my nap." And I'm like, "What do you mean?" But
Yeah.
I needed that compassion from him like, "Hey, you're really good at putting boundaries around your need for sleep and I'm not. Like, can you offer that compassion to me a little bit when I say I want a nap? Like, yeah, Sarah, don't feel bad. Go take a nap. I got this." Because that doesn't come as easy for me. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, and I think for this step in particular, it can be useful to look at what were your models, right? So my guess is your mom, given the little bit of a story you shared about her, wasn't a big napper.
Yeah.
Whereas it's interesting in my experience, complete opposite. Like my grandmother strongly encouraged naps. My mom is the best sleeper on the planet. So same with me. I go to bed every night at like 9:30. My husband could be reading, all the lights could be on. In fact, I remember I was at a conference, I was sharing a room with a colleague, and I'm like, do whatever. Actually, this has happened to me several times. I'll just flat fall asleep. All the lights can be on. And I think it's interesting if you have role models that value rest, this is a lot easier than if you don't. And it's helpful. And I think same thing with any of these steps. If you have role models who valued gratitude, who valued living into their own desires, some of these steps might be easier for you if it was just a natural part of your life versus if you have to change what you were taught early on. That can make it tougher. Because there certainly are other things that I wasn't modeled that I've had to work on. So I just think that's a valuable thing to just get curious about.
And rest, like you mentioned, it can look different for so many people. It's not always a nap.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's even like I'm like you, a high energy person. I feel rested by this sometimes, right? I'm doing something that
Mm.
I feel is important to me and exciting and a great conversation. So for me, my microdose might be I really need a conversation with people. And I need those
Yeah.
conversations as I'm becoming an adult to be on my calendar. Like my girlfriends from college, we talk once a month on the first Thursday of every month, and that's what's in my calendar. You know what I mean? Like that's the thing
Yeah.
that makes me feel rested. It's not always sleep. But this really does
Yeah.
bring me to the last one. If you want me to step into
Mhm.
there,
Yeah.
you were asking me earlier. Well, what if you don't know about your desires? And so I wanted to talk about that and include that in my answer for N for burn. So burn was brag, unique desires, rest, and then N is your North Star. So your context of why you're choosing the things that you're choosing to do. And in the show notes, I'll give you the link for some of this thinking of where I heard someone talk about this, but really the difference between thinking versus contemplating. So,
Mm.
thinking is that thought, that loop that drains you. It's like, I really should send that email. I should send that email. I should send that email. But what should I say? But if I send that email, and you could have just sent the email in
Right.
2 minutes,
Right.
5 minutes,
Right.
right?
Right.
It's that loop and it's draining. You usually feel stressed after you do it. And you think in some capacity, if I think about it, it's going to somehow take less time. Whereas contemplating is when you think, why is this difficult for me to do this? And how can I
Mm.
be result oriented and really contemplate what can give me clarity here? It's actually really
Yeah.
difficult for me to send emails because I am dyslexic and I worry that I'm going to say something wrong. And what tools do I need in order to make this where it's not so scary, whatever it is, right? And
Mhm.
really being honest and contemplating with yourself. So I think the more that we can catch, is this something worth contemplating, or is this just something I need to just freaking do and I'm thinking about? It's not actually something that needs to be contemplated. And
Right.
then
Right.
when we
Right.
spend some time contemplating, you can get a little bit closer to your values and what's really important to you. Like I've heard you mention your daughters, super important to you, and being able to have home where at night it's just expected that we are not working, we are going to sleep. Like these are your values. These are things that are
Mhm.
probably infused in your work, they're infused in what you teach, they're infused in your client care, they're infused in your family. It's who you are. It's not just something you talk about. And so
Mhm.
really contemplating around what are a few of your values, and that'll help you to have that north star for everything else beforehand. Like this
Mhm.
is why I celebrate when I close my computer at 7 p.m. and I
Mhm.
celebrate that. And even if I'm desiring that, I have an assistant to help me do that even more. And this is my unique desire, is because I want my family know that nighttime is for connection, and I'm doing that, right? And this is my microdose of rest, because when I turn off my computer, I light a candle. When that candle's lit, I am not answering the phone for anybody that's not an emergency. Like,
Yeah.
then you start to really be able to, it's not, we're talking about it like it's a linear thing, and you brag, and then no, this is like a circular,
Yeah.
just a way of living, like concepts in a fun little acronym that you can remember or not remember, but just like, how can I do this in a circular way? And even notice ways that, for example, you're already doing this and you can celebrate it and do even more and more.
Yeah. I really like that. I think that North Star, you have to know where you're going at some level to be able to keep that moving, swimming, if you will, in the right direction. So before we wrap up, what has been the hardest thing about, making this work transition for you?
Oh, perpetual fear. Learning how, because when you, how do I say, whenever I help entrepreneurs with some of this too, like you do. And they'll say, how do I just get rid of that fear that no patient will ever call to book a consult with me? And I am like, that fear is part of what you signed up for.
Mm,
But you prove to yourself that in the reality, I have not had a single month where I didn't have a higher income and better life balance at all since, and not even just a little bit, like a lot better since I started, even the first month I started. So you prove to yourself more and more that you can trust, and you can trust that some months are going to be higher than others, that's, that some months that this kind of up and down is normal, and that fear starts to evolve into trust. And also you start to look at fear differently, because fear is very close to that excitement of change. They feel the same in our body. They don't always
yeah.
feel that different. And so you start to think, oh, okay, this means I actually care about this thing. Like, I actually care about clients seeing me because I know that my work is making a difference. So
Yeah.
you start to look at it not as such this terrible thing, but learning to do that, it was so scary. And learning to change, alchemize fear, that fear means I'm somehow doing something wrong, that I am wrong, into this is just a normal part of entrepreneurship. And the more that you try and do different things and grow and not be stagnant, the more that you'll learn to process that emotion, but it's not going to go anywhere, has been, that's
Yeah.
just, I'm sure there's things that you're still a little bit scared of sometimes. Even when starting this podcast, that's been very successful.
Oh, sure. I mean, yeah, I think it's, as you said, your relationship with trying new things, with fears. I would say the older I've gotten, the less afraid I am of things like work related things, for sure. I mean, I had a very intense experience where I almost died of COVID pretty rapidly. And that was an interesting shift, because I don't really fear anything like the day-to-day stuff. Like, is this going to work? That kind of stuff I don't
Mm,
fear anymore, because I I got to see, I guess that's how I could frame it. It wasn't something I would ever wish on anyone, but I did get to see that, like, it can be gone quickly. So
mm,
that experience changed that fear. But I would say even before then, I guess I've been lucky enough to have enough. I think there's a level of privilege there as well, because
yeah.
I never have been in a real position where I was going to be homeless and starving if this didn't work out. And I have a degree. I can go back and get another job. There's just peace in the knowing that, even the fact that my grandmother, I was very lucky in that I almost all of my grandparents lived well into their 80s and 90s. So I knew a lot of them. I mean, one of my grandmothers lived, actually, two of them lived until I was in my 40s. And several of my great grandmothers lived until I was in my teens. So I heard firsthand stories of people living in the Depression and things like that. And honestly, they were fine. And so, it was hard. There were big challenges there, but I've never even had to live close to that level of danger, if you will. And so I think for me, I never had that level of fear because I've been privileged
Mm.
enough to it would be very unlikely that anything I do would land me in that level of desperation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and being the closer, having had a near-death experience, which I did not know about you, and I'm really glad that you're doing well. So thank you for sharing. But the
Oh,
closer
thank
you
you.
are to all of our, inevitable death, and then also if you have a family member that passes, I feel like the wisdom that comes with that is really beautiful and helping. There's nothing that accelerates knowing what's important to you and your North Star than something like that, right?
Oh, sure. And I think when we're building a business, there is a lot of potential fear of I think the biggest fear is that I'll look dumb, if that makes sense. Like that this won't work out and I'll look dumb, right? This is kind of the core of what I hear from my students. And I think if we're able to feel, if that's something you're able to transcend by recognizing that there are a couple of people in your life, and I think this might actually be easier for people who are older because I did not grow up having people look at me all the time. I see this as a different challenge for my kids because that social media exposure is a level of kind of like that sense that people have to like what they see online and things like that might be something that's harder for people that are in their 20s, even 30s now that I just never had to deal with. So I think that's interesting to consider. But I think what
Mm,
can be helpful is that if there are two or three people that, like, no matter what you do, no matter how dumb it turns out, they're not going to care. They're still going to love you. It can be helpful to just connect to that and then recognize that, like, if everyone else on the planet thinks you look like a fool, doing whatever
yeah.
online or in your business or in your marketing or whatever, as the great Mel Robbins says, let them. Who cares?
I So this was actually something I really struggled with. So I'm going to digress here if that's okay to this
Yeah.
topic because I really am passionate about bridging the gap to from unwanted pain to pleasure, and I talk about sex a lot.
Hmm.
And so talking about sex and talking about burnout and all of these things are connected. There's a reason Emily Nagoski wrote the book Come As You Are and then the book Burnout if you look at her
Yeah.
trajectory,
Yeah.
right? So these
Yeah.
things are very very connected. It's not just about issues in the tissues, but also that gap to pleasure. And when I started to talk about these things on social media, I was terrified. I was terrified of my peers being like, what are you charging? I was terrified of, I have so many degrees and someone being like, you're calling yourself an expert. I was literally terrified of saying something wrong, of doing something wrong, of hurting someone's feelings, all of it. And someone that I adore. Her name's Kelly Deals. She's a feminist copywriter and a coach in a lot of these things. I'm going to tell the way she described it, but she's like, Sarah, one day I was sitting and I'm a single mom and I'm breastfeeding my children. I haven't been sleeping and I'm watching some motivational video where they're telling me just to wake up a little bit earlier to
Hmm.
do XYZ. She's like, I'm literally have multiple babies on my boobs. I cannot wake up earlier. I'm not sleeping. And so
Yes.
she said to herself, when I am going to write something, I genuinely close my eyes. I don't think about my mother. I don't think about my husband. I don't think about my peers. I think about the woman who is holding multiple babies in the middle of the night that needs to read this letter. And
Yeah.
that's who I write for. So I love your example of just thinking of like one or two people, but for me I try to think about that person that thinks she's a terrible physical therapist or a terrible coach or a terrible MD because she wants to help people with sexual wellness, but all she learned about was issues in the tissues and not this bigger picture, and feels like she's terrible at her job because of her own neurodivergence and her own multiple interests and all this stuff. And I am writing to her, like I am writing to that person,
Yeah.
and that little trick really is genuinely something I use every time I sit at my computer to write an email or a post or anything.
Yes, I love that. And I think it's in a way two separate things. So I think who this is for gets you out there, if you will. Like you're creating that post, you're writing this video, you're launching that podcast, you're writing the book, whatever the thing is, starting the practice, because that is for the actual women who are going to be sitting in front of you, whether it's in telehealth or in person. That is the only people who matter when it comes to what you're writing and putting out in the world. But I mean, for the person who's doing it, a sense of safety. So that person who's afraid to leap from her job to doing that, the sense of safety can be grounded in just two or three other people who probably are never going to even read
Mm,
those posts. They have nothing to, they don't, your husband, your mother has nothing to do with, like, she doesn't care what your posts say.
yeah.
But she's probably not even going to see them, right? My husband doesn't see 90% of what I post. It doesn't. Why would it show up on his feed? He's not a
Yeah.
woman, right? And so,
Yeah.
so the one or two people, your best friend, who even if you end up looking stupid on the Tonight Show, isn't ever going to love you less. And I think if you yourself is at home with there are people who love you, even if you do something dumb or you make a mistake or you say something that doesn't resonate with the standard, whatever. And then that's just for your own nervous system grounding. And then you're exactly right. The effort is for the person that you can see at home, double breastfeeding, exhausted,
Yeah.
struggling with perimenopause, struggling with infertility, whatever the struggle is, the work you're doing is for them.
And you make up such a good point. None of this is possible without a sense of safety and toggling out to where, to that mom who's breastfeeding and doesn't have enough social structures and doesn't feel safe, it's not her fault.
Yeah,
There's micro doses of these things that she can do, but it's not possible for her right now to start her own business where she takes off for a month. That's just ridiculous. That's not
right.
safe for her anyone. And the
Yeah.
privilege that, you know, I have in knowing that I have this degree I can go back on. My husband has a very stable job that I knew if things just went to poo poo caca, that like I didn't have 5 kids at home that wouldn't eat. So really
Mhm.
grounding into that's not those systemic things that aren't in place for you is not your fault.
I think real quick, that's an important part of the burnout conversation, that the
Yeah.
tools, the BURN tools, can be used at any time, even for a woman who's at home, you know, breastfeeding to a toddler and a newborn. There is still, I think, a need for connection to those microdoses of your own self-care in a way that's really deep, that the burn acronym represents. And I think it's important to recognize for people that are looking to make big changes in your life, there's a time for it, there's a pace for it. And, we all recognize that you're working within the systemic structures that make it very difficult for some people to do it at certain times. So there's also no rush. Like, you can make micro steps in those
Yeah.
directions too. You were able to make a big leap, but you had some things in place. Same as me. I mean, when I left my clinical jobs and started doing this, I actually had a breastfeeding infant, but I also had in that moment a husband with a stable job, sort of. He was an entrepreneur too, but if you can get clear about what safety means for you, it's usually a lot less than you think you need. Like, we sold our
Yeah.
house, we moved. Like, there were many times where we went way below what I maybe thought I would have needed a couple of years before that.
Well, I think that burnout culture and the way that traditionally outside of this conversation people talk about burnout is that it places the blame and the responsibility on an individual, and
Mhm.
especially tells women that they aren't doing enough, having enough, being enough. And so if you get anything from this conversation by listening, to this, I want to read, end on this quote from Pooja Lakshmi that I love, and the concept of burnout. The burnout is a societal betrayal. Burnout places the blame and thus the responsibility on the individual, and it tells women they aren't resilient enough, they aren't doing enough, even though it's directly to many broken structures around them. So I hope that some of these tools, despite those broken structures, help you to have a life that lights you up, one that feels amazing to your soul, and one that you're not blaming yourself for societal betrayal.
I really appreciate that. Thank you so much for sharing your tools, your personal journey, because I think hearing the inside of that is really what's helpful for people who are making these kinds of leaps. Like, everyone has fear. This is always hard. You're not alone. This is how it really is. So thank you for vulnerably sharing that story, and enjoy your time with your family. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. And I look forward to connecting with anybody after this podcast. This was such a great opportunity.
Yes, and definitely dive into the show notes. We will include all the links that Sara mentioned and how to get in touch with her, her website. What's your website and best place to get in touch with you?
So if you go to www.bettersexbysara without an H, so bettersexbysara, SARA.com, I have this really wonderful newsletter that's incredibly I only send one about a month, and it's very useful. I put books like this, I put sexual wellness resources in particular, and really useful videos there. So if you register there and you just respond to your first email with the word burn or Jessica Drummond's podcast, I will hook you up with all the things that I mentioned today, including the books that I mentioned, the workbook about burn that I mentioned. I have a video on that, and anything else that you want. I will make sure you have all those resources. So that's probably the best way, is getting on my email and then just sending me a quick little email with the word burn or Jessica Drummond, and I got you. I got your people.
All right. Thank you so much, Sara. That's perfect. Thanks everyone for being here, and I'll see you next week.